where you are. I hope you're having a great day. To kick us off, I would like to acknowledge that I am sitting on unceded Dharawal speaking country. I'd like to pay my respects to the traditional owners of this most beautiful land that I get to look out on whilst locked down from home, and pay my respects to elders past and present, and to the elders and ancestors on whose lands you're based on, wherever that might be that you're zooming in from. I'd also like to respectfully acknowledge Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who might be watching this webinar with us. Those of you who have signed up for this and who are watching already know that money matters. It affects what we do, it affects the decisions we make, it affects how we live, it affects our future plans. It affects whether and how we can stay warm and dry and safe. It affects whether and what we feed our kids and whether we have to skip meals. It has serious implications for our futures, our education, our jobs, our housing stability, our stress levels, our relationships, our health, and even things like the likelihood of contact with the justice system. Money matters. In Australia right now, and indeed in many countries around the world, we're reeling from another economic shock as a result of the global pandemic. Well, at a macro level, Australia has fared actually pretty good, and the government has actually put in a whole lot of supports in place to enable this to happen. We know that at a household level, financially, we have seen some very big disparities between the haves and the have-nots. Household debt in this country at 3 times income level grew steadily from 19% in 2003 to 4 to almost 30% by 2017 to 2018. So we've seen rising debt levels in this country. Over half of lower income households who are renting from private landlords are spending more than 30% of their gross income on rent, putting them under enormous financial housing stress. We know that over or around 30% of households have less than 1 month's worth of income in savings, which puts them at a precarious position in terms of how many paychecks you have left before you're in trouble. And that 1 in 8 could not raise $2,000 in an emergency. We know that around 1 in 2 Indigenous people were in severe or high financial distress. And shamefully across this country, around 1.2 million children and young people live in poverty. This isn't just an issue for people who are unemployed or underemployed, and we've seen the new ABS figures be released today. And while unemployment rates have gone down slightly again, underemployment has gone up, which means we have more people who are working but actually need more work and cannot currently get it. We also have an issue in this country with the working poor and our precarious workers. Wage growth has not kept up with inflation over the last 5 to 10 years. And we know that 1 in 4 workers don't have access to any paid leave entitlements, which puts them in a really difficult position when they're sick, their kids are sick. And we've seen this play out in the situation over the last 15 months with COVID. And while, of course, you're much more likely to be in poverty if you're unemployed, if we look at households living below that 50% median poverty line, more than 1 in 3 of those households have a person who's employed in that household. Money matters, and we do have some serious disparities between those who have it and those who don't. At CSI, we have spent many years understanding it, who's got it, who doesn't. We've been partnering with many different organisations across the government, corporate, philanthropic and community sectors to better understand and improve who has money, who has access to appropriate financial products and services. We've been looking at the components of financial resilience and what helps and hinders when people face financial shocks. And now, and over the last few years, we've moved to looking at financial wellbeing. This is our latest partnership with the National Australia Bank, who have been very strong supporters of CSI, and I thank them for that. We have been partnering with NAB over many years, but this is a new partnership around looking at financial wellbeing in Australia. And I'm really proud to be releasing the Insights report today in partnership with NAB. Like the other work that we do at CSI, we strive to understand what's happening, not just at the individual level, but also at organizational and societal levels. If we're going to create the kind of change that we want to see, we need people to be able to both zoom in to understand individual people's experiences and what that means for their lives, but also to zoom out and understand their lives in the context of the world that they and we all live in. So on that note, let me welcome my colleague, Jerry, who has been one of the leaders of this report, and he can talk about financial wellbeing more fully. Thanks, Jerry.
Yeah, so thanks for the introduction, Christy, and thanks to everyone who's made the time to come along today. I'm delighted to officially launch the Amplify Insights Financial Wellbeing Report written by myself and Dr. Jack Noon. It's really exciting to see so many faces here. And with everything that's happening this week in New South Wales with the extension of the lockdown and the news yesterday from Victoria, I think it's a really important moment to be thinking about the systems and structures in our society and how they influence personal financial wellbeing, and indeed our wellbeing more generally. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the term, previous work from CSI has defined financial wellbeing as when a person is able to meet expenses and has some money left over, when they're in control of their finances, and when they also feel financially secure. That's now and in the future. Within this definition, there are three interrelated dimensions. The first is meeting expenses with some money left over. This includes having an adequate income to meet basic needs, to pay off debts, cover unexpected expenses, and to have some money left over. The second is being in control of your finance. This includes both feeling and acting in control of your finances. The third component is feeling financially secure, and this includes not having to worry much about money and having satisfaction with your financial situation. We argue throughout the report that these all are things that are external to, or are all dependent on things that are external to us. That is, the structures that are around us. So when we talk about the financial wellbeing system, there are three different levels which we're talking about. There's the micro level, and these are the factors related to financial wellbeing that occur at the individual or household level. And this can include both personal and group-related things. Personal factors are the things you have some degree of control over. For example, the level of education you have. Group factors are things that are related to the specific groups or cohorts you belong to, and typically you cannot control the impact that they have. For example, your age or your gender. The meso level, these factors deal with the influence that organizations and institutions have on personal financial wellbeing. And the macro level, these factors deal with the large structures of our societies and the influence that these structures can have on personal financial wellbeing. Factors at each level can shape the income and expenses for the household and thus drive financial wellbeing outcomes. So this is a simplified diagram, and this is from the report. And this is how we help to visualize the financial wellbeing system. The macro and meso level drivers feed into the experience of individuals at the micro level. In turn, these will shape the money coming into a household and the money going out of the household. Meso and macro level factors can also influence each other. For example, government policy decisions is a macro level factor, and these can change decisions that organizations make. We've seen that through the pandemic. The important thing to understand is that not every driver or factor has the same impact on every household, and your personal context is a critical factor in how you experience the macro and meso level drivers. For example, the pandemic was a macro level event that's had different effects on different households depending on who you were. And to help demonstrate that, we're going to go through the example that we use in the report. So Lynn's our example from the report. She's made up, but lots of Australians have had their financial wellbeing impacted in similar ways by the pandemic. And these issues are ongoing. We've seen it in Sydney and Melbourne in the last couple of days. So Lynn was a 36-year-old hospitality worker, and she's a single parent living in Melbourne, Victoria, with a 9-year-old son. Lynn's highly financially savvy. With a high level of financial capability, she knows her rights and what she is eligible for in terms of accessing government support. Unfortunately, during the second Melbourne lockdown last year, the business Lynn worked for was forced to shut down during the lockdown. As is common in her sector, Lynn was a casual employee, and that meant that she was not eligible for JobKeeper. In turn, that meant that Lynn lost her job and moved on to JobSeeker, which has a lower rate of payment than JobKeeper. during the later stages of a lockdown, the gap for Lynn from that was $338 per fortnight. Her son was at home because schools were closed through the lockdown, and as the primary caregiver, Lynn needed to look after her son, which limited her work availability. Because her son was 9 instead of 8, Lynn missed out on being able to access childcare subsidies for her son and also be able to access childcare generally. Lynn needed to look for work, but because she was looking in a new sector where she was less experienced, it was harder for her to find employment. Lynn's 36 years old. If she was 35, then eligible employers that hired her would qualify for the $100 JobMaker wage subsidy, which was announced in the November federal budget. If she was 29, that subsidy would increase to $200 per week. Because Lynn isn't eligible for this, she's a less attractive employer than someone who would qualify for the subsidy. So there's a lot that I've just said there, but let's take a look at how that fits onto that system map we showed just before. So let's start on the left there in the top corner with the macro level. So Lynn's eligibility for either supplement was based upon a distinction made in a national policy. And it's easy to imagine a different scenario where the rate for job seeker and job keeper were the same or very similar, or that eligibility was not based upon the type of contract. So being a casual worker didn't matter. And we've actually seen different eligibility criteria in the newly announced support measures in Sydney. At the MISO level, the preference of her sector to use casual employment influenced her eligibility for the support as well. If Lynn was working in a different sector, it's easy to imagine that she instead had the right kind of contract and therefore was put onto JobKeeper instead of JobSeeker. At the group level, her age and gender were relevant factors for multiple reasons. In terms of gender, gendered norms about caregiving meant that women were more likely to take on additional caretaking and work reduced hours during the pandemic. And that happened in lots of different countries, not just Australia. Her gender is also associated with the sector she's employed in. And the fiscal stimulus measures originally announced last year tended to be higher in sectors where men made up the higher share of the workforce. So her age, again, as mentioned before, influenced her eligibility for JobMaker hiring credit. And then finally, at the personal level, having a dependent influenced Lynn's capacity to look for work. If Lynn did not have a dependent, there would have been a whole range of extra employment opportunities she might have been able to take up during the pandemic. For Lynn, if we change any one of these factors without her or about her, it can change her level of financial well-being. And these things are all largely outside of Lynn's control. For example, Lynn can't change her age and make herself eligible for JobMaker. If we return to the definition of financial well-being I gave earlier, all three parts of Lynn's financial well-being have been negatively impacted by the pandemic. First of all, by losing her employment, Lynn's had her ability to meet expenses impacted through a reduction in her income. Secondly, there are some parts of Lynn's financial situation which she's no longer in control of. Her ability to return to employment is determined in part by the continued impacts of the pandemic and what they will continue to do to the economy. It's easy to see how she would feel like this is outside of her control. Thirdly, the lockdowns in Sydney and the new cases in Melbourne right now highlight that the pandemic continues to have an ongoing effect on how we feel about our financial situations and on the situations themselves. And that's looking like it's going to continue to impact people into the future. Altogether, this can help us to see that for Lynn, the key drivers of her financial well-being during the pandemic were outside of her control, and they continue to impact her future. Improving financial well-being for people like Lynn requires an understanding that we need to address factors that people can't control. And that means we need structural changes. But no single actor can make these structural changes on their own. And that's why in the report, we're calling for a more coordinated response across the wider financial well-being ecosystem. And just to be clear, there are already organizations with a collective system change approach, and we have seen that being more coordinated can be impactful in creating change, like with the Raise the Rate campaign led by ACOS. We're interested in building up our understanding of the different points of leverage in the system and that can be used by different organizations and how this can be used to drive system change. And for us, that means mapping the system. We need to continue working on the issues at the micro level that people are already addressing and organizations are already addressing. But we also need to be more deliberate in changing the meso and macro level factors. This will help change the systems and structures around us and create positive financial wellbeing outcomes. Our next piece of work will be creating a detailed map of the system to understand the system from the perspective of people experiencing low financial wellbeing, and to understand how different organizations can help improve those situations for people. I'll finish up here, but I'd like to first invite you all to read the report, which is available at the link there on the screen. Thanks for coming along today, and I hope I've helped to highlight why a systems approach captures some of the key drivers that we need to be thinking about. I'll pass over now to Dr. Jack Noon, my excellent co-author on the report. Jack's a senior research fellow at CSI UNSW, and he does work on financial wellbeing and also on collaboration. Jack, over to you.
Thanks very much, Jerry. It's an amazing piece of work, so I think congratulations to you. And I particularly love how you've taken an 80-page report with 250 odd references and turned it into a 10-minute presentation. So well done. But this is just the beginning of a longer journey, and we want everyone to rally and come together. So that's the call to action. We need a coordinated approach to address the issues that Jerry has raised. And to assist in this process, we're posing you two questions. But to see those two questions, you have to follow the link that Rhonda and Nick are going to put in the chat feed, which is quite clever of us, I think. So have a look at that later on. But now we're just going to move over to the panel discussion. I'll introduce our panelists one at a time, and I've just got a couple of little questions to ask them. One of them is about a money story that I'd like them to share with us, because everybody loves money stories, and I think they really bring what we're talking about home. So our first panelist is Phil Usher. Phil's the CEO for the First Nations Foundation. Phil, thank you so much for being with us here today. Can you start us off by just telling us a little bit about yourself, a little bit about your organisation, and also maybe a money story that you might want to share yourself?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having me on. Phil Usher, CEO of First Nations Foundation. We're an Indigenous-led non-for-profit, do financial wellbeing, education and resilience training for Aboriginal people right across Australia. I guess one of the money stories that sort of sticks out for me is I had one of these friends, like when we were in our 20s, who he was always kind of savvy with money. You know, those guys that are into stocks well before you really should be, and investing, and just really had a smooth approach. And I asked him where he got all this information in a really quick period of time. We're talking like early 20s. And he said he got it from, it's sort of a family technique that he learned from his grandmother that passed down through the families. And it's the old envelope approach of the 60-20-20. You know, granddad would bring home the pay, 60% would be set aside for the rent and the food costs and all the other essentials of living. 20% would go towards savings or for a bit of fun to enjoy. And then 20% would go into sort of investing, which was mostly bonds at the time, he'd said. So that was carried through, you know, a couple of generations and something that he'd implemented from a young age. It's still really effective today. I was also doing community outreach as an Aboriginal liaison officer in La Perouse. And one of the aunties took us out to bush. It's not really bush in Sydney, but the bushland there, and just sharing some stories. And she was talking about, you know, when she was growing up, how she had to get a medical certificate to say she was clean enough to work next to non-Aboriginal people. So I just think of these two women that are sort of the same age. One's got this pretty sophisticated, simple but sophisticated financial system, and the other one doesn't even have the opportunity to sort of earn money. And if they do earn money, we go back to that financial well-being about what's left over. By the time you pay rent and a bit of food, well, there's not much money left over. And so this was only recent as well in sort of the 70s that this happened. So that always just sticks out in terms of the two really comparisons.
Yeah, great point. I think we'll come back to that a little bit later. But before we do that, what was your take-home message from the report?
Yeah, I think there's a system in place that works well for probably 90% of people, and it's the 10% that kind of fall through the gaps, which is, you know, really hard when you've got a massive organisation. How are you going to cater to the needs of everyone? But it's probably really amplified over sort of the last 12 to 18 months. You know, I think of some of the Aboriginal customers in those regional remote areas where, you know, they might get a letter from their superannuation fund saying, please respond by X date. And because they're so remote, by the time they receive it, the date's already passed, and then, you know, it's a 4-hour, 5-hour drive to sort of the post office. So, yeah, it works for 90%, but it's 10% of people that fall through the cracks.
Well, that's a structural issue I've ever seen one. Thanks, Phil. And one that's like, there's a solution to that. So thank you. Campbell is our second panelist. So Campbell leads the NAB Assist Financial Hardship Program. Great to have you on board. Same questions for you. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and the NAB Assist program? And of course, we'd love to hear a money story from you as well.
Yeah, and I enjoyed, thanks Jack for having me, and good afternoon everyone. I really enjoyed trying to think about the money story actually, so I'll come to that in a sec. But yeah, Campbell Morrison, work for NAB. I lead the NAB Assist team, so we do hardship, vulnerable customer support for all NAB customers regardless of product. So it's a great role in the sense that I lead a business where people can go home at night and say, actually genuinely help someone today. There's not many jobs where you can do that. So we've got 700 colleagues in NAB Assist doing that every single day. But in terms of my money story, I'm a farmer's son. So one of the things, and maybe it's a bit similar to you, Phil, a lot of the way you think about money comes from your parents or your grandparents. So my parents taught me that nothing comes without work. So I had a whole lot of chores I had to do each week to get my $1 New Zealand pocket money. So that's about 70 cents Australian for those who are wondering. And so I had to do the chooks and the dogs and cut the firewood and set the fire and get the pine cones every day. Otherwise, the dollar didn't arrive. And if I missed one day, the dollar didn't arrive. So it wasn't sort of a marginal applied thing. But I thought the interesting money story, and one of the things my parents taught me was patience. There was a thing called lay-by back in the 80s. I don't know if it's happened, but I wanted the Star Wars board game in the 80s that was $40. So you multiply that out, that's 40 weeks of my pocket money set aside. I put this game on lay-by for 40 weeks and paid it off every week for 40 weeks. I took my dollar into the shop, and eventually after 40 weeks, I got it. And the issue with that was by the time 40 weeks went by, I didn't even want it. So the moral of the story is one, patience, but two, be careful what you commit to over a long period. And the other thing I thought of, and I remember my mum talking about this, was a thing called AppPro back in the 80s, where you could take clothes, for example, from a clothes shop home, try them on without paying for them, then bring them back if you didn't want them. It's almost almost the opposite of buy now, pay later, right? I'm not sure shops would do that these days. So,
yeah, I'm not sure either. I suspect maybe not.
Probably not. And second question, what did I take from the report? A couple of things, really. One, I'm a banker, so I like the stats piece of it. I found some of those stats really scary. Every time I read them, I find them scary. So, the 3 times debt to income ratio piece, I find that really, really frightening. And the other one is the 1 month of savings, 30% of people or colleagues or customers not having 1 month of savings to cover. And we've seen that play out. Even with the latest New South Wales lockdowns, after a couple of weeks, we've seen a flow into hardship quite quickly. So it sort of plays that theory out a little bit. But I also loved the Lynn example. And what it got me thinking about was there's just single elements of that system that in isolation don't seem to be that effect, causing that greater problem. But when you combine them across a full system of pieces, we've got some bigger problems to think about. And I think as banks, we sometimes get self-absorbed in how we can help customers ourselves without going, what's the bigger issue, bigger picture?
Which is a question I'm going to ask you about later. Little spoiler alert.
I'm preempting it for you.
Thanks, Campbell. Our next panelist is Jodie Kennedy. Jodie's the General Manager for Charitable Trusts and Philanthropy with Equity Trustees. So a really warm welcome to you, Jodie. Thanks for joining us. Tell us a little bit about yourself and about your organisation as well, particularly the Trusts and Philanthropy division, and again, that money story.
Great, thanks, Jack. I guess mine was probably more money reflection than anything, and the reports that have got me thinking about my childhood. And again, a bit like Campbell, I was raised on a farm in New South Wales and was one of 5 kids. And, I learned from a pretty young age about the impact of financial insecurity on families. And I guess the link for me is that's what's really has driven me to be so passionate about advocacy and equity. And it's really what I guess has forced me into this amazing career where I'm trying to make a positive impact through everything we do as a funder. So just some background in terms of Equity Trustees and what we do for those people who don't know. I lead a team that oversees the gifting of around about $100 million every year to the community. So we're very much a large-scale funder and a team of sort of philanthropic specialists. And we work with both legacy trusts, so granting from perpetual trusts, but we also work with a really excitingly growing number of clients who are actively practicing philanthropy through their lifetime. And we've got that really exciting job of working with those hundreds of families to really help them to think strategically and from a structured giving point of view about how effectively they can impact some of these more complex issues through their giving.
Thanks so much, Jodie. And just like the other guys, we've got some questions specifically from a funding perspective to ask you a little bit later.
Yeah.
I'm going to move back to Phil just for the first question. Phil, what are the key things that must be considered in the promotion of financial wellbeing for Indigenous peoples?
I think, one of the ones that comes to mind is just sort of how new it all is for Aboriginal people. It's I find there's a healing process that sort of needs to happen before just getting in and budgeting. We've seen plenty of ministers in this space, thinking that, we'll get in and we'll teach people how to budget and it'll be great. I have a methodology for that. But there needs to be more attention paid to, I guess, the healing process of what sort of happened historically. So we see, whether our parents or grandparents, where, we've covered, that's where you get a lot of the knowledge, with they're placed on missions and or given rations, whether it's flour, sugar, tea, blankets, tobacco, that's sort of all the resources they had to manage. So there's no financial resources to manage there. We've got the stolen wages cases, how they'd work, but the wages were held in trust for the government to be paid at a later date. That didn't really happen. Or again, when we did start to go into the workforce, it was that really basic entry-level role. And I'm talking up to the 80s, 90s, where this sort of happened, where, again, you pay enough to eat and have some shelter or rent or whatever it was. So there's not a lot left over to sort of manage. So we see a consequence now of the closing the gap, where we're pushing employment and we're pushing Aboriginal people going into these really cool roles, except we don't have that generation above us to go to say, right, how do we start building intergenerational wealth? How do we start investing, buying a home? What's that process? There's just this lost generation of knowledge. So I think there's sort of a healing process that we need to appreciate for Aboriginal people to go through and say, we're not bad with money because we're Aboriginal. There's just a few other things that kind of happened, and that's why we're lagging behind the general population.
And Phil, are the programs being run at the moment that you think are doing this really well, or even if you just want to share some of like your favorite programs with us, endorsements are totally fine.
Yeah, have to do a cheeky plug here for sure.
Go for it.
So that's what we embed in all our training. We first address that part, and when we do it face to face with our education training, like you can see a real breakthrough for the people participating, because even Aboriginal people, younger ones haven't heard of the stolen wages or don't know to the detail of what happened on the missions and everything like that. And it's just a breakthrough to say, we don't have to be bad with money. That's not a default. Certainly where I grew up in Housing Commission, getting a disability support pension and commission housing was sort of the extent of a financial plan, because you're pretty set. So when you grow up knowing that, that's all you know, that's all you kind of aspire to. So I think what we do really well, whether it's our online training by Money Dream or our face-to-face training, we really address that cultural kind of aspect first, and then we go on and teach the finances.
Right, sounds amazing. And to all the people listening out there, if you have a specific question for Phil, feel free to pop it in the chat and we'll see if we can get to it. Onto you, Campbell. Can you tell us how's the NAB Assist program, how it's evolved over the years and where you'd like to see it to go?
Yeah, it's been an interesting, probably 5-ish year journey, Jack, for NAB Assist. And, if I cast my mind back 5 years, we were essentially a collections house. We were chasing customers around for money that they owed us, right? Kind of in an old school fashion. And 2 or 3 years ago, that changed to assisting customers, not collecting from customers. So there's a piece there where we trust our colleagues to trust our customers. And so we made it also much easier for customers to deal with us. I think the fear, there's 2 things. One, reaching out for hardship assistance can be seen as shameful, so a lot of people don't want to do it. And if you make it hard for them once they do that, i.e. give us the 29 pieces of paperwork, maybe pretend you're a local city council sort of thing, that puts them off as well. So we have no paperwork, we have a conversation, and we trust the customers telling us the truth, which 99% of the time they are. So that was a real cultural shift for us, and in some ways changed the very face of the person we had working for us. We had people coming in that really wanted to help customers, not people coming in that wanted to transact and chase customers around. So that was part one of the journey. Once we've done that, now we're starting to look at what are sort of channels of choice for customers. And again, back to this, I'm ashamed, I'm in hardship and I don't want to reach out. How can we make that easier for customers? So digital channels like the app, internet banking, self-serve IVRs, all that sort of technical banking stuff. Why that's important is between 10 p.m. and 2 a.m., a lot of our customers are looking on our hardship sites, but they can't talk to us because we're shut shop at that point. We're building ways where they can actually apply for hardship, get it approved at that time of night, and then move on with their lives. So they go to sleep with no stress versus stressing all night. So kind of from collections to assisting to digital, make it easy for customers is the journey we're on. And the other thing we're doing, which I am excited about, is starting to get proactive. One of the things banks have, which we don't always use, is lots of data, and starting to look at the data we've got, and even better, look at the data that other banks and institutions have got, and reach out to customers before they're in hardship. We've got a model that says 80% of the time, we will know 3 months out you're going to fall into hardship, and whether that's your pay's not coming in, you paid a bill on a different cycle. Even with the app, you were looking at the app once a month, now it's 10 times a day. They're all things that tell us something's changed. So we're starting to push back up that curve rather than kind of ambulance bottom of cliff trying to help. Let's talk to you before you're in trouble. So again, that's where we're trying to get to. That's utopia for us, as we're talking to you months out from when you're in trouble because stuff's starting to change.
Yeah, well, you had me at data. That sounds really great.
Most people don't like it, Jack.
Oh, come on. Just really quick question for you. How would you like to see corporates contributing to the systems change work? What's your 1 minute answer?
Yeah, 1 minute. I think data, use our data to help sort of guide decisions and get further up the chain. And I think the other thing we do is we do navel gaze a little bit, and we like to pontificate and talk about stuff. But you know, what are the 2 or 3 things we can do as big corporates this year that'll make a difference? Lock them in and get on with them versus spend 12 months talking about them. So action, not discussion, would be my philosophical answer.
Yeah, great. And same idea as for Phil. Like, if you have any specific questions for Campbell, just pop them into the chat. Over to Jody. Jody, what are funders looking for in proposals that are looking to create social change? And what are some of the pitfalls that should be avoided?
Yeah, good question, Jack. So there's no one size fits all answer to this question, because typically there are many different types of funders with different preferences. But from our experience as a large funder assessing lots of requests from the community for funding, typically it comes down to 3 really simple things. Number 1, clarity. So you must always articulate what the problem is you're trying to solve for, why it's important, and what in fact that funding is going to help you to do. So we don't need rocket science as a funder. We just need to have a very clear elevator pitch and keep it simple. Problem, solution, outcome. Secondly, you're going to love this one, Jack, is evidence. So how will we know that what you're doing is having the intended effect? And how are you going to show your funder that it's achieving the change that you said you were going to try to achieve? So you've got to be really articulate when you're looking to seek funding around what data and evidence that you've got to actually demonstrate to a funder that you're making progress and you're sticking to your purpose. So, and the last thing, which is innovation, and that's become especially important since the disruption of the pandemic. And what we're hearing from not just ourselves, but from a whole range of funders at the moment, is that it's now much more important to them that they seek partners who can demonstrate their ability to innovate and to adapt their offering or their services, just to make sure that they remain relevant in uncertain times. And so organisations have to remember that it has to be, an innovation has to be new and a better way of doing things. So those are sort of the 3 things that we're always looking for when we're assessing requests for funding in this space.
I'm really glad this is being recorded, because I'm going to go back and listen to that again. Thanks, Jody. Could you just, in a couple of minutes, could you tell us about like one of your favourite initiatives that you support, particularly if it's got like a systems change flavour to it?
Sure. So every year we make about 3,500 grants. So I've picked just one of my favourites that really focused on addressing meso and macro barriers. And whilst we didn't specifically set out to address financial wellbeing in this initiative, on this occasion, it's the funding that we gave to the advocacy campaign led by the out-of-home care sector. So it was called the Home Stretch campaign. And it was essentially a campaign that was designed to raise the age of statutory responsibility for young people who were living in home care from 18 to 21 years. So the evidence we knew told us that within 12 months of 18-year-olds leaving out of home care, 50% would end up homeless, incarcerated, unemployed. We had all of the data and evidence. So our decision to fund this particular campaign came from feedback directly from the sector saying that changing the system in this way is actually going to change the prospects for these young people. So while we could have taken the easy route and just funded the individual's experience whilst they were in the out-of-home care sector, we purposefully redirected our funding from a micro-level intervention to something that we knew was going to support a movement and would deliver a macro-level outcome. And we really amplified the voices of those young people with lived experience to make sure that they were getting that support they needed till they were 21. So we felt this was a much more effective way of actually driving a positive outcome for those young people.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to hear how they get on as well. Again, if you've got any specific questions for Jodie, pop them in the chat. That, I think, bang on time. That actually is probably, I think, the end of our panel discussion. And now we'll just shoot to Q&A. So just give me 1 sec while I see if I can pull up a couple of questions. What I'm going to do is I'm going to choose a panel member to answer them. I love this level of power that I have now. First question is, well, someone said, I love the money stories. Do we know if there is anything happening across our schools to embed this sort of thing into students? It would resonate more than business studies with a lot of students. Actually, I don't know who the best person is to ask that. So maybe I'll leave that open to the 3 panelists. Who would like to have a go at that?
Yeah, I can give that a go.
Yep.
Sorry. There was a big push for financial literacy education in schools and to teachers have a curriculum. And one of the parts where it fell down is, you've got to have a confident trainer and someone who specialises in that, obviously teachers specialising in their area. And I think one of the downfalls is they found that teachers may not actually be to the highest level of financially literate themselves. So if they're not around all this financial education, then it's really hard for them to sort of go on and teach it. And it's one of the things we look for when we have our training. The trainer themselves being competent is really, really important. So there was this big push recently, and then I think there's just been this little trouble in that kind of delivery area because they assume that the teacher may be the best person to teach at when they mightn't have the experience themselves.
That's fascinating. Well, there was somebody else that wanted to respond to that as well. Was that you, Campbell?
Yeah, I was going to make a couple of points. I know Scott Pate, for example, is starting to roll out sort of the Barefoot Investor, financial literacy stuff, which I think is really important. And the banks have dabbled in it. At ANZ, which was my former employer, we had the Money Minded program where I went to scout groups or sports clubs and presented it. The issue there is the perceived conflict of interest, right? You're going in to sell products to school. So we need to kind of find a way to get around that. But I reckon it's really critical. And Phil's right. There's an assumption that the presenter is actually financially literate rather than just going through material. So I reckon it's critical, but I think a whole lot of different organisations, community and corporate have got to come together to kind of sponsor and build a program that schools are comfortable with. And there's no perceived or actual conflict of interest at all, but critically important, critical.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Campbell. And if anybody's got any follow-up questions for that, just shoot them in. The next question's for me, which I like because, it can be about me. The question is, keen to hear from Jack about his vision for how we come together to achieve change for the system. So we're always talking about the system, the financial wellbeing system, like specifically, but we actually don't know exactly what it looks like. So one of the next things that Jerry and I are planning to do is actually to start mapping that system. And we do that from different perspectives. So we do it from people that are experiencing financial hardship to actually find what their barriers and enablers are. And then we do the same sort of process with politicians, with program owners, with organizations, with corporates. And you can look at those different system maps and see where there's gaps and overlaps and actually what's going on. So that's like a first step. After that, we really want to engage with the broader community because ultimately it's actually up to everybody listening to this call and beyond to decide what they'd like to do so that can actually happen. Jerry, would you like to add to that? Is there anything there that I've missed or that you want to talk about?
I think I would add that, an important point, and just to stress on it, is the idea that we're trying to build up an understanding about, I use the term points of leverage. So different organizations have different capacities to enact change, and understanding how they fit into the system, in my view, is a really important way to progress forward with driving structural change. Like, we can all be interested in wanting to make change, but depending on the area that we want to see something happen, we need that piece of people that have influence in that space. And I think that's where and collaboration is quite important on that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Jerry. Next question is for Phil. I'm curious if you have examples of Indigenous healing at the First Nations Foundation that's happening or needs to be happening around poverty trauma, relational trauma, intergenerational trauma.
Yeah, so ours is obviously focused on the financial healing. There's a lot of spiritual healing that needs to happen as well, and a lot of it focuses around your self-worth. You come from such a challenging background and so far behind the eight ball that you really don't back yourself in situations, and even if it's basic stuff like where you're aspiring to in a career, rather than just going for what might be a sort of entry-level role, how can we build the capacity for people to, aspire to program manager, state manager, general manager sort of level? Because the expertise, particularly in the Indigenous space, your ability to go out and communicate with community and get them on board and to build programs, that qualification is just as valuable to organisations as, an accounting degree or a finance degree. So that qualification, you should really own that and focus on honing that if that's what you want to do. So it's lots of conversations around that, and saying that, we do deserve money. We do deserve to build intergenerational wealth. I know traditionally it's not part of our culture, but, it's not so much the more money we have, we can then give away to family and support, that immediate kind of connection. So we talk about those kind of different perspectives of Aboriginal wealth and non-Indigenous wealth as well.
So Phil, where's the place to go for people that want to learn more about this?
Our first place is a website called tomorrowmoney.co. It's probably designed for Aboriginal youth 18 to 30, but they're the real entry-level kind of questions around money. Whether it's getting a tax file number, superannuation, buying a house, whatever the question might be. And 60% of the content on there is written by Aboriginal people. So it's a really shared experience website. So you'll be able to communicate and feel, I guess, understood from the stories that are written in that content.
Great, thank you. I actually have a question to ask, hopefully all of you. I'll start with Jody. So we're asking for greater coordination across the financial wellbeing ecosystem. And by ecosystem, I basically mean all of us, including community members as well. So anyone with a stake in financial wellbeing. What do you think needs to be in place so that we can achieve this?
It's a very good question, Jack. I think some of the things that, again, speaking from the funders' perspective, some of the things that we need to do is to work out how we avoid this lack of collaboration, or we encourage more of an environment of collaboration between funders. And I think when it comes to the funding piece, we have to try to remove that competitive dynamic that sometimes exists within the for-purpose sector, where people feel that they're all competing for the same pot of money, and it doesn't help us to achieve our long-term goals faster. And it comes back to those core principles of better data and research, which obviously CSI and this report is really moving towards, and people's mindset, I think, around moving away from that individualism and leaving behind that kind of ego that is often attached to giving money philanthropically. And it's taking a step back and actually saying, I don't need to own projects. I don't need to be the sole funder on this project. I actually need to be more willing to contribute and come together and actually look at that systems level at who's playing in this space and who's doing what, and where is there already duplication, and where is that sweet spot where I can really add maximum value in the one role that I play in this really complex sort of problem.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's like, we're not, like, no individual organisation or person can do everything on their own. No. So it's like, if I had my way, there would be a like a national strategy for financial well-being. I know there's a strategy for financial capability, but it's bigger than that. But to be able to develop that strategy, we need to be able to pull people together first, which is a really exciting piece of work to do, I think, and something that we can do. Like it is achievable. Next question. Let's flick this one on to Campbell. Oh, this is a good one. I like this one. Given the report and what's been discussed today, what would you do differently at work tomorrow?
Yeah, I think there's two things. I think one, I shared the report with my head of hardship yesterday, and she was genuinely excited by it, scared by it, but excited by it, and started to go away and brainstorm things she could do differently. So that certainly there's a sharing across my own organisation piece. The savings piece and use of savings buffers historically at NAB and probably at other organisations where we've asked customers, what can you pay towards a debt? And we've taken whatever they've offered up. But it's the next question around, well, does that leave you with a savings buffer? So including that to a greater degree. But I think the other piece is I'm part of a bigger, broader group of banks, even if you look at it from an ABA perspective, is trying to make us think a little bit differently about it as a collective. And Jody, to your point, I think it's not a competition to see who can help the most customers. I think we're together in this. So it's trying to get around, let's try and come up with something secret versus I've got something great, let's get everyone doing it. So that'll be the three things, Jack.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Campbell. What about you, Phil? Is there anything different you would do tomorrow or the next day?
Probably not too much, given that this is sort of our bread and butter that we do
true.
every day. For people on the panel, I reckon it's worth having a look at the generation above you and sort of where you've come from, and that change over the generation. I see, my nan used to set rabbit traps and iron for money. Dad had full-time stable job all of his career, and I've moved into a CEO role, which is quite pretty cool progression over 2 generations. And I've studied all those rich lists relentlessly, and you can even see why some of them are self-made. They've had parents, like I have a look at Mark Boris, who's done extremely well with Wizard and Yellow Brick Road, but his father was like a general manager of an organisation. So even having that experience, those conversations, managing staff, charging what you're worth, asking random people for money, just having that available at home leads to that next generation. So I think, acknowledging just how far you've come and how hard it is to, go from one generation to the next. Whilst it might look easier for other people and they're doing quite successfully, just think about where you've come yourself or where other people have come in that one generation gap.
Thanks, Phil. That's really quite powerful. Jody, what would you do differently tomorrow?
Yeah, look, from my perspective, I think it's about making sure that my team and all of our clients who are funding some of these incredibly important interventions and projects is to persevere with the complex problems, because too often we as funders take the easy route and we fund the things that are exciting and they're really obvious. And yet where we find we have the most impact, I think, is when we take a bit of a risk and we actually we dare to fail and we tackle the complex problems. We fund things that aren't typical and they're not safe. And we look at where is the glue in the system that's missing. And we have this amazing privilege where we can fund those things, and we see such exponential impact when we do that. And that's certainly the strategy of myself and the team. And that's what we try to teach our givers. We need to change. We need to be much more strategic, and we just have to reach out to the whole community and do it as a collaborative effort.
Yeah. I'll actually stick with you, Jody, because there's a relevant question that's just come up for you. Other projects, campaigns or organisations that receive donor/grant support sustainably supported beyond initial funding to ensure that structural and deep systematic change can happen?
Yes, and that's something that's changed probably certainly in the last few years. Many funders like us, we have now moved beyond that kind of 1-year cycle of granting. We've recognised that social impact doesn't happen overnight. You can't give someone a cheque for a year and then expect them to do great things with that. You actually have to look at the long-term problem. And we have, generally speaking, we will have 3, 5, and sometimes 7 or 10-year funding horizons and partnerships in place. because it's critical. And often we fund sector capacity building. So we fund people, and we fund positions, and we fund critical parts of them delivering their service. So we can't just come in and give money for a finite period of time. So we're really looking to the long term when we're looking at building the capability of those organisations to actually grow and scale and leverage and attract further funding. So that's absolutely is at the forefront of our thinking when we distribute our money.
Just you might have a few more proposals on your desk following this.
I was worried about that.
This is a question, one for everybody, because I think you might each have a different perspective on it. We'll start with Campbell. What should the role of government, Treasury, be in encouraging and enabling greater collaboration for systems change and financial wellbeing?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and it's come up during COVID. What's the role of the government to support customers versus the role of corporates? For example, I think the government can bring us together and drive that change, and they have the authority and the gravitas to do so. And I think the ABA, for example, does quite a good job of doing that. But I do know during COVID, when the Treasurer or someone from the Treasurer's office has suggested something, we move really quickly. So they can create urgency by doing that. I don't even think they need to fund it, Jack, but they certainly need to create that urgency for corporates to move. So I think that's the role they can play.
Yeah, well, urgency is like key in the collaboration space. That has to be there in order to bring people together.
Yep.
Thanks, Campbell. Phil, over to you. What do you think the role of Treasury government could be in this piece?
Yeah, I think one of their strengths is they can be the ultimate mediator, I guess. There's no secret that the big four banks are competitive, and the large insurance companies are competitive against each other. But this is one of the areas where I think Jody said, you need to leave the ego at the door and work collaborative. And if the government through Treasury, or I know ASIC are doing a bit of work in that space between the big four banks to say, just be that middle person where there's no favoritism to anyone at that table apart from the well-being of the customer. I think, initiating and having some of those, whether they're steering committees or, working groups, I think they can provide that.
Thanks, Phil. Jody, anything to add there?
Look, just to say that government's role is critical, I think, and one of the things we see is between, corporates, government and the philanthropic space is we don't work closely together enough to ensure that collaboration is happening. And so we're all coming at the same problem from in different ways, and sometimes that's not the best, doesn't produce the best outcome. So I think, again, it's just paving the way, removing red tape and ensuring that collaborative communication is there to facilitate that collaboration.
Thank you. A question for me, it's an interesting one, and I might flick to Jerry as well. What, in your opinion, is on universal basic income, which could take some of the complexity out of who gets money? It's not a total solution, but could help greatly. I can say that there is some evidence from a Finnish study that showed there were some positive outcomes of the basic income idea. I would speculate that in order for it to work, there has to be again, that belief across society that that's something that should be done. So it's got to be, the populace has got to believe that we want to do that in order for it to be, successfully implemented. But Jerry, is there anything you'd like to add on the universal basic income idea?
Yeah, so universal basic income is kind of a complex question in terms of, it's helpful if you remove some of the filtering mechanisms and make support easier to access, but it's a real question ultimately around adequacy of that support. So I'm going off the top of my head here from one of the stats from the report, but I think in Australia, around 22% of households receive some form of income related to social security support of some kind or another. And to me, that highlights that, that's 1 in 5 people are receiving some form of assistance. That tells us there's need for that across the wider population. And if we then think back to the question around, during the pandemic, when we doubled the rate of job seeker through the coronavirus supplements, the payment, it lifted a lot of people out of poverty immediately. It was the rate, though, that mattered, not just whether people had access to support at all. And that's the piece that is quite important, that we need to be thinking about, not just do people have access to it, but is it adequate?
Thanks, Jerry. We're coming to the end of time. I think we might put a hold on additional questions from here on out, but we'll obviously look at your questions after the webinar and see if we can put together some kind of broader response. I'd just like to reiterate a couple of things. Again, big thanks to Jerry for all the work you've done. Big thanks to our supporters at NAB and to everybody else that actually helped us with this report, and of course all of our panel members as well. I especially want to do a big shout out to all of those organisations that are working at the micro level, helping people with their day-to-day money management work. Like that stuff is vitally important, and it needs to carry on. I guess all we're saying is that we need to be working together a little bit better to be a bit more coordinated. So in terms of that call to action, I want us to be able to come together in some way and decide as a group what we want to do next. I think the best way that we can start that, is to go to the website that Nick and Rhonda have put up, and just to answer those two questions. I can give you a little spoiler alert. One's about what you're doing at the moment in terms of those micro, meso, and macro level drivers. And the other question is about what kind of role would you want to play as an organization or as an individual? Do you want to be a leader? Do you want to be a doer? Do you want to be a communications expert, a knowledge translation person, a community advocate? There's so many different roles that people can play, and we'd just like to know, like, what in an ideal world, like what you would actually want to do. Answer those questions, flick it back to an email, and then it's a case of watching the space, I think. So before I hand back over to Rhonda, big thanks to her as well, and Nick for organising this, and Anna as well. I really hope you enjoyed the webinar. I certainly did. It's been a great piece of work. Thanks again to all our panelists, and I'll hand back over to you, Rhonda.
Thank you so much. Thanks to everyone. That was a really interesting webinar, which I'm sure our audience would agree to. I encourage you to visit impact2021.online for more info about our webinar series and to access all of our recordings. But for now, we'll wrap up. And we will send a follow-up email, I should say, with all the links, in particular to the research. Thanks so much, everyone. See you later. Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody. Have a great day.